He paused his typing. The marks on the woman's neck troubled him. Next to the imprints of the murderer's fingers, there was a reddish stripe that seemed to have been made post-mortem. He wondered if she had worn a necklace that had been yanked off, not that it mattered anymore. Like all the unclaimed dead, she too would be consigned to the cemetery of the companionless. So yes, I was born in Strasbourg in France to Turkish parents, and the first house that I was brought into was actually full of immigrants, leftist students, lots of students from the Middle East, and it was a house full of books, gouloirs, smoking cigarettes and talking about revolution. Afterwards, my parents separated, and my father stayed in France, and my mother brought me to Turkey, because for her, Turkey was motherland. It was where she belonged, whereas for me as a child, it was a completely new country to discover. And in this state, we came to my grandmother's house in Ankara, which was a very conservative, very patriarchal, and inward-looking neighborhood. So the second house that I came into was completely different than the first. And from then onwards, I was raised by two women, by my grandmother and by my mother. And these two women were very different from each other. Grandma is more Eastern, if I may put it this way. She was more irrational, more superstitious, a bit more spiritual. And my mother is pretty much the opposite, very westernized, very rational, very modern, urban. And so I grew up observing these two completely opposite female characters, and yet the solidarity and the sisterhood between them, which was very important to me. Afterwards, I spent parts of my childhood in Madrid, in Spain, in Amman, Jordan, a little bit in Germany, Cologne. In my early 20s, I moved to Istanbul on my own because I thought this was the city where I should live and write my stories. But also as a writer, I think from time to time I felt suffocated in Istanbul, mostly because of the lack of freedom of speech. So I moved to Boston, then I moved to Michigan, and I moved to Arizona. And I lived in Arizona for a while, back to Istanbul, and then about 12 years ago I came to London, and the UK became my adopted country. And I feel like a Londoner now, and I feel attached to this country. And the reason I'm sharing all this is because I think it is possible to have multiple belongings, multiple attachments. I care a lot about multiplicity, and I refuse to be narrowed down to a single and singular identity. And if I may add this, throughout my life, I think I felt like wherever I go, it is literature and the art of storytelling that keeps my pieces together. It gave me a sense of continuity and coherence. And I've always connected with life through stories, through the art of storytelling. I was brought up in a matriarchal setting in a very patriarchal society. Turkey is not only patriarchal, but it has become increasingly so over the years. I think it is a very sexist society. I think it's a very homophobic society. And I wish I could have said we have made progress over the years. I'm afraid it's the opposite. In many ways, I think we have been sliding backwards. And I also know that wherever we see a rise in ultranationalism, religious fundamentalism, populist authoritarianism, we will see an increase in sexism, we will see an increase in homophobia, we will see patriarchy being consolidated. These things are not coincidental, they always go hand in hand. And that's why I'm a big believer in sisterhood and women empowering women. I think if we can do that, the impact of that kind of solidarity goes beyond generations. It changes. It changed in my story, not only my mother's life, but also my life and probably my children's as well. So that's why I do believe that we need to see more sisterhood, more solidarity among women. There's something else I want to share with you. As I said, I lived in Boston for a while, and I would just spend the entire time locking myself in a little room inside these gorgeous libraries that the universities there provide. Just reading 1960s, 1970s African-American women's movement and what their legacy. I learned a lot from that. So when you read people like Audre Lorde, for instance, or another example from another context, James Baldwin, whom I admire deeply, all these people put a lot of emphasis on multiplicity. So Audre Lorde, for instance, would say, look at me, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a poet, I'm black, I'm this, I'm that, and I'm many more things that you might not be able to see at first glance. I think that kind of multiplicity should be at the center of women's movement. And it's something that we're lacking today, because unfortunately we lost that emphasis. Today we're much more interested in creating safe spaces, homogeneous spaces, where like-minded people come together. But I think we need to open up women's movement. The kind of feminism that I long for goes hand in hand with, definitely with LGBTQ rights movement, but also it's the kind of feminism, the kind of women's movement that brings men on board. Because I think in a patriarchal society, clearly it's not easy to be a woman, but I think it's not easy to be a man either, particularly if you're a young man. You know, if you're a young man who doesn't conform to given descriptions of masculinity, your life is going to be very difficult. So we have to work together. We are in this together, and that's why maybe going back to my childhood experience, what I've learned from my mother and grandmother is women and men from different backgrounds, we have to find these and nourish these networks of solidarity. There's no doubt we're going through strange times and very unsettling times. And unfortunately, this is a moment in history when we are seeing, and I'm afraid we will see even more, the rise of tribalism, nationalism, isolationism. We are being told constantly by demagogues that we will be safer if we're surrounded by sameness, that we should retreat into our tribes. That is an illusion. We are far too connected across the world. To me, nationalism, ultranationalism, or closing the doors on others is never the solution. I think we have major global challenges ahead, starting with climate change. Our planet is burning. We have major problems ahead, and they're all connected, such as cyber terrorism or financial crisis or the possibility of another pandemics. Clearly, the coronavirus crisis has shown us that what's happening in one part of the world affects the lives and livelihoods of people living miles and miles away, right? A virus in China changes life in Canada. So we have to collaborate. We need these intercultural exchanges. And yet the irony is, this is happening at a time when nationalism is on the rise, when tribalism is on the rise. In my opinion, we cannot deal with global challenges with the forces of ultranationalism. We need a new perspective. We need a new narrative. I wish we could teach ourselves and our children the beauty of humanism, the beauty of multiple belongings, but we're doing the exact opposite. What we're teaching our children is you're only one thing and one thing only. Turkish nationalism tells children at school today, this is how I grew up when I went to school in Turkey, that we are a nation surrounded by water on 3 sides and enemies on 4. And that the only friend of a Turk is another Turk. That you can't trust anyone. You can only trust people of your own blood. That kind of blood and soil nationalism is incredibly dangerous. It brings paranoia, it brings xenophobia. This is not coincidental, it's intrinsic to it. But fast forward today where we are, I think that kind of wind affects the entire world today. Until recently, people used to think that some parts of the world are more solid and safe and steady. These are the democratic places. And some other parts of the world are liquid countries. And you need to fight for human rights, you need to fight for women's rights or democracy or freedom of speech in those liquid lands over there, but clearly not in the West. That was the perception. I think after particularly 2016, that dualistic perception of the world has been shattered to pieces. Because now we know that you can't take your rights for granted nowhere in the world. Now we know that history does not necessarily always go forward. And now we know that there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. And in fact, we're all living in liquid times, which means even in the advanced democratic countries in the Western world, you can see history moving backwards. So we all need to be more engaged, we all need to be more alert, and we all need to care for human rights, minority rights, and freedom of speech. I think for me the drive has always been to try to understand who are the people who have been disempowered in a society at a given moment. Who are the people who have been pushed to the margins, the periphery? What are the forgotten stories? So in other words, of course, as a storyteller, I am in love with stories. I chase stories, I love language, I love words. But I equally am interested in silences. So it's not only stories, but silences. When I think about a particular context, I try to understand where are the silences, where are the taboos, what are the subjects that we can't talk about easily. I think a writer's job is not necessarily to try to give the answers. I don't like it actually when writers try to preach or teach something. I don't like that kind of literature. But I think a writer's job is to ask questions, difficult questions about difficult issues, and open up spaces, free spaces where a diversity of opinions can be heard. And then it's always up to the reader to come up with their own answers. But I should create that space. I sincerely believe the novel is one of our last remaining democratic spaces. Because in our life, in our lives today, we're constantly being pulled into different tribes, clashing certainties, and only in literature or art, in limited spaces today, we can hear difference of opinions, and that is incredibly important, and we can still put ourselves in the shoes of another person. Literature, for me, from the very beginning, has not been a necessarily autobiographical endeavor. Of course, as writers, when we write, we reflect our own journeys, our own thoughts, our own perceptions, there's no doubt. But writing stories is not necessarily saying, look, this is my story to other people. I am much more interested in not being myself. I'm much more interested in becoming someone else, and then someone else. So that almost transcendental journey. By birth, we're all born into a certain identity, a certain gender, a certain class, a certain nationality, religion, whatever. But when we read a story, at least for a few hours or days, we become someone else. And that experience is incredibly precious. It is an intellectual experience, but it's almost like a spiritual experience. And then suddenly you start seeing things through the eyes of another person. If we lose that, we lose empathy. And there is no doubt that a world that has lost its empathy is going to be a much, much darker place. I believe inequality is one of the most important issues of our time. Not only this moment, but for many, many decades. We need to have sincere conversations about inequalities in our societies. And especially the pandemic has revealed those inequalities so sharply. The pandemic didn't create those inequalities. They were already there, but it made them more clear and obvious. And in that regard, when people say, when are we going to be able to go back to the normal? I don't want to go back to the normal because it wasn't normal before the pandemic anyway. We need to talk about class inequality, we need to talk about racial inequality, we need to talk about gender inequality, but all kinds of discrimination. Where are the gaps? What are the barriers that are preventing us from having honest conversations? What are the barriers that make children from different backgrounds unable to access education, equal opportunities? We also need to pay attention to this growing chasm between urban and rural. If all the capital and sources are concentrated in the bigger cities, such as London, and you leave very little for the rest of the country, that is a huge inequality. You can't have this kind of regional differences. So there's a lot we need to talk about. I think social justice, social cohesion, And how can we together build a much more egalitarian society? These should be our central questions. And again, especially with the pandemic, we have had to see what kind of world do we want to live in? What are our primary values? Is it mostly about money? Is it mostly about profit? This neoliberal system that has, with greed, entered every inch of our lives, not only the markets, but also education, also health system, every inch of the society. Is this what we want? Or do we want to prioritize democracy, freedom, a much more equal society in which everybody is welcome, nobody is excluded? What are our priorities? And what kind of a world do we want to live for our children and our grandchildren? I honestly think we're at a very crucial crossroads, and the decisions that we're going to make today will have a huge impact for definitely many generations. And I'm worried because I don't think we have much room for making mistakes. If we choose the path of more of the same, which will create even more inequalities, in my opinion, it will be a big mistake, and we don't have that luxury. We don't have the luxury of making those mistakes anymore. I don't think it's a coincidence that societies that are relatively more peaceful and have achieved a better prosperity and democracy, where the civil society is more robust, are also countries where you see investment in libraries, where also you see encouragement of creativity and arts and culture. In other words, for me, arts and culture is not a luxury that you can dispense with. It is as central as the air we breathe, as the water we thirst for. This is how we connect, as human beings. And if you cut them off, if you start to push them aside, the whole society will suffer from that. I think East and West, we are all going through a tunnel of uncertainty. And it is clear that in the post-pandemic world, we are going to see economic turbulence, we're going to see rising numbers of unemployment, and even more inequalities. When we go through such enormous challenges, I think it's even more important that we do not forget to support arts and culture. Unfortunately, sometimes politicians in different parts of the world make the mistake of thinking that, well, now economy is a priority, arts is a luxury. Arts is just a secondary issue, we can just sweep it aside. It is not. It is vital. And actually, if you cut that off, the impact of that is going to be enormous, not only for the coming generations, but in this very particular moment. Because if we lose our ability to communicate, to empathize, this is going to have massive political consequences. It is not a coincidence that in every society where we have seen a decline in democracy, we have seen increasing tension, increasing polarization. Demagogues love antagonism. That's why they're constantly trying to divide the society into us versus them. If we can all retreat into our zones and hate each other, demagogues love that. That is how they thrive. That's how they remain in power. For a healthy democracy to exist, there has to be proper respect for diversity and inclusion. And for that, we need arts. We need to know each other's stories, because as human beings, we're all emotional creatures, and we connect through emotional intelligence. We connect through empathy. For that to be alive, we need arts, we need creativity, we need culture, and ultimately we need the art of storytelling. Yet another soul whose life echoed the opening of every Anatolian tale. Once there was, once there wasn't.